Born on the 27th of April 1759 in Merriall, England, Mary Wollstonecraft was a writer, philosopher, and women's rights advocate. Now often dubbed the mother of modern feminism, she outlined her beliefs in social equality and female empowerment in her book A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792. In her own lifetime, Mary's unconventional lifestyle overshadowed her work, and even nowadays, most people only ever heard of her passingly as the mother of science fiction. I guess birthing, paradigm-shifting stuff just runs in the family. On the 10th of November 2020, it looks like Our Lady is finally getting some much overdue attention when a statue of her is erected in London after a years-long campaign. And oh boy, did people have some strong opinions about it. There were criticism and backlash to the backlash, and I even joined in the fun with a little discussion on my little Instagram with my Instagram followers, which, by the way, if that sounds like your kind of thing, join us over there. We do have a lot of fun there. Shameless plug! Now, I'll touch on all of this a bit later, but just as a quick summary, I don't think the statue told the story of Mary Wollstonecraft at all, but it wasn't really trying to, which may sound odd. It was trying to do something else entirely. Now, that's all fine and good, and we'll talk about it, but I do think Mary's story is really cool, and it's one that deserves to be told. Telling stories just happened to be what illustration is all about, and I just happen to be an illustrator. So I thought to myself, why not illustrate Mary Wollstonecraft? It'll be fun, I'll get to learn more about her, and since I've always wanted to make a video documenting my entire illustration process from start to end, I thought I could take you along with me on the journey. Hopefully you should come away knowing how I illustrate stuff, and along the way learn with me about Mary Wollstonecraft and her story that I'll be attempting to tell with my work. And maybe have a tangent or two about the difference between fine art and illustrations and public statues, this one in particular. So, you know, like, comment, subscribe, ring bells, grab a cup of tea, and without further ado, where do we start with an illustration? Well, in this case, we are starting with step 0, because this is not something that I do with every project, but I do with this one. Obviously, when you're working with a client or when you're back at university, the client or your tutor will be giving you the brief. But on a self-initiated project like this one, I am my own client and I have to give myself a brief. Now I have to think like a client. Why do clients want illustrations? Well, illustration is at its core visual problem solving and communication. You have a problem, there's an idea you have that you need to get across to an audience. The illustrator's job is to take that idea and present it, usually visually, in a way that allows the audience to understand it. This is the main difference between fine art and illustration that I touched on earlier. Fine art is not interested in whether the viewer gets it or not. It presents a thing, a scene, an idea, a concept, and the beauty of the whole thing is that everyone can look at the same thing and come away with completely different interpretations. Illustration, on the other hand, needs to communicate. If an audience comes away from an illustration not getting the original message, then that piece of illustration, no matter how beautiful a piece of art it is, has fundamentally failed. Say it's a book cover, viewers should get a sense of what the book is about and want to pick it up and find out more. Say it's an editorial, it should convey the main points of the article and make that block of text easier to digest. If it's a commercial for gin, then it should make you want some gin tea. That's not to say it is rigid, an audience cannot see other things in a piece of illustration. That is great, that's fantastic, but that is all bonuses and add-ons, not the main goal. This difference in objective is why sometimes fine artists would look down on illustration as commercial and lacking in artistic value, and why illustrators might look at fine art and see a bunch of snobbish, pretentious pricks lacking a connection with reality. If you want to get petty about it. Anyway, having said all that and given you a very specific set of criteria to judge me on, what is our brief? A. What's the problem, or the message we want to deliver? Who is Mary Wollstonecraft? That's what we're trying to crack. B. Who's the audience? Well, It's you watching this video. Modern people of the 21st century, adults who have passingly heard about Mary Wollstonecraft and vaguely aware that she's an important feminist, but know of her little more as a trivial fact at a dinner party. Who still has dinner parties? The active goal is to get those people, you people, intrigued, to tell as much of her story as possible in one picture, and hopefully entice you into being interested and finding out more about her yourself. That's our brief. My course leader back in uni, Chris Draper, is just full of words of wisdom. Here's the first one. At the beginning of every project, figure out what the brief is about, and then become an expert on it. So, our brief is about Mary Wollstonecraft. Let's go find her. I like to do everything in my big working sketchbook. I open a gazillion tabs and just do a thing I like to call brain vomit. I'd start reading, listening, watching, fall down any rabbit holes that seem relevant and interesting, and noting down anything that stands out. I really like to spot links and connections about how one thing leads to another. I like to spend as much time on this step as possible. Sometimes one of the rabbit hole threads will end up in a eureka moment. Most of the time, they just open up a lot of possibilities ready to be explored. After a bit of time, here's what I gathered. First off, a quick biography. The daughter of an abusive drunk, as a young woman, Mary worked as a governess, an experience that inspired her views in one of her first publications, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, published in 1787. In 1788, she began working as a translator for the London publisher Joseph Johnson, who published several of her works, including the novel Mary, a fiction, as well as her now best-known work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which calls for women and men to be educated equally. What a radical notion! In 1792, Mary left England to observe the French Revolution in Paris, where she lived with an American, Captain Gilbert Imlay. In the spring of 1794, she gave birth to a daughter, Fanny. The following year, distraught over the breakdown of her relationship with Imlay, she attempted suicide. She then returned to London to work again for Johnson and joined an influential radical group which gathered at his home and included William Godwin, Thomas Paine, Thomas Holcraft, everyone's favorite artsy-fartsy bonkers grumpy granddad, William Blake, and after 1793, William Wordsworth. In 1796, she began a liaison with Godwin, and in early 1797, a now pregnant Mary married him. The marriage was happy, from what we can tell, but brief, and Mary died 11 days after the birth of her second daughter. Mary. That Mary. So, what can we glean from this? Well, first and foremost, she was a woman of action. From her letters and writings, we know Mary to have been a woman of passion, who cared deeply for the people around her. One way or another, death, abandonment, well-meaning but ultimately disastrous post-mortem betrayal put a pin in it. Mary always found herself back to relying on her own 2 feet. So, action, passion, but also a sense of otherness. She's never alone, always in the middle of a crowd, but often lonely. Mary was of course a writer, but definitely not of the armchair variety. Not only did she feel very deeply, she's also a very keen observer, preferring to write from first-hand accounts in the middle of the action, fiercely committed to the art of transcribing reality. During her time in Paris amidst the French Revolution, Mary actively sought out journals, letters, and documents recounting how ordinary people in France reacted to the revolution. She was one of the few voices that argued for sociological, economical, and political causes to the upheaval, instead of demonizing poor starving peasants and chalking the whole debacle up to the entire nation of France going mad, which was what the British government was trying to do at the time. Mary was also a woman of contradictions. She fiercely demanded not just for her sex to be treated equally, but for women themselves to rise up and seize their own independence, saying in her most famous work, "It is vain to expect virtue from women till they are in some degree independent of men." And yet some of the most crucial events in her life revolved around men. The pain of rejection from a man led to her becoming suicidal, and she later married another man in order for her second child to be born legitimately, shielding her daughter from hardship by conforming to the social structure she was actively criticizing. Perhaps she saw her own misgivings as cautionary tales and used her work to ward other women away from tragedies like the ones she had to face. A classic case of do as I say, not as I do. From all that I could piece together, I saw Mary Wollstonecraft's life to be a short and harsh one, dying at the age of 38. But her character and legacy, based on the people and works that survived and inspired by her, ultimately is one of defiance and hope. This feels to be the most important factor to keep in mind as I proceed. While we're here, let's look for some inspiration. Chris Draper's word of wisdom number 2. Illustrators are magpies. We see shiny things, we like shiny things, we collect shiny things, we organize the shiny things so that when the appropriate situation arises, we can use said shiny things to make more shiny things out of. Designers may call this part mood boarding. First, there are 2 surviving images of Mary Wollstonecraft I could find, both by John Opie. From the research, there are some semblances of ideas that are forming in my head. I know I want something dramatic, bustling, cosmopolitan, because Mary, and the words keep coming up time and time again, is always in the middle of the action. For this, I consulted my Big Punch book, Sean Tan, Charles Robinson for some potential whimsy, and my own work, since I spent a lot of time studying old school European architecture on location, and have done a lot of research on similar subjects for a past project. Now, it goes without saying that it's fine to be inspired and influenced by other people's work. What is not fine is stealing. It is what we call in the industry shitty, unethical behavior. Don't do that, okay? Cool. Right, I reckon we've got a pretty solid little situation here. Let's get down to business. Depending on which illustrator you ask, this might be their favorite part of the process or the least favorite part. Regardless, it is the most important. Ideas generation. Chris Draper quote number 3, a good idea is everything. Or was that Don Draper? Might have been both. Everybody goes about generating ideas differently. I prefer to use thumbnails. Now, if you're in art school and the word thumbnail just shot a cold shiver down your spine, trust me, I used to hate thumbnails with a passion as well. But that was until I stopped seeing it as something I have to do to tick a box, but instead as quite a useful tool. My thumbnailing process goes: get inspired by the research, picture an idea in my head, make barely legible scribbles, annotate thoughts on it, what's good, what doesn't work, what needs to be thought out more, consult the research, rinse and repeat. Then pick out the ideas with the most potential to develop further. Discard the rest. A professional client will require you to develop at least 2 ideas and give it to them to pick between. This is also a really good routine to force yourself out of an art block. Here I ended up with 2 I really like. I like the drama, movement, and intimacy that the low angle and the Dutch tilt bring to this one. The crowd and angled buildings, a bit reminiscent of that famous Dark Knight poster, also add a claustrophobic feel, which is very fitting for Mary, who was very often stuck, both physically and ideologically. I really like this composition, so I might save it for a future thing, but for this project I decided to go for the second design because I think it ticks more of the boxes. Then it's on to the rough, or the final thumbnail. It's a larger thumbnail in which I finalize every element in the composition. I tried to spend a good chunk of time on this because it will be my main reference for the artwork. If this is a colored illustration, I'll also make an additional rough thumbnail to show what color should roughly go where. And that's all the hard work done. All that's left is to draw the thing now. For real. Cause I don't like you either. Here I've got the paper for the final artwork already taped up, ready for me to draw up the bigger version of the final thumbnail. An additional perk to all the thumbnailing and refining is that by this stage, I would have drawn this composition enough time for this to be almost muscle memory. Plus, I live for the thrill of potential disaster every step of the way. The penciling here is purely line work. It's also where I finalize absolutely all the tiny little details. pays to not be lazy here since this is the last step before the permanence of ink, so I try to leave no stones unturned. This might be my favorite stage of the whole process. After all the big compositional blocks are laid down, and I can just go in and obsessively add all the little details. I especially love drawing these little houses, they're so fun. For me personally, it's the little things that ties a piece together and make it come to life.
The grocery store still lets you choose between paper or plastic.
I am what you call a traditional dip pen and ink illustrator. I have made a video about all the technicalities of dip pens and nibs and inks and all that kind of stuff, so if you're interested in that, I will link it up here somewhere or below in the description. By this stage of the illustration, I've already done all the brain work, so I just relax, pop on a podcast, an audiobook, or a little music and enjoy the craft of it. While you kick back and enjoy the, in my opinion, quite satisfying inking process, let's have a little conversation, going back to the 10th of November 2020, when the world was introduced to Sculpture from Mary Wollstonecraft by Maggie Hambling. My first reaction to this was probably similar to everyone else. That's not meant to be Mary, is it? And no, it's not meant to be Mary. It's a kind of floating, silver, twisty cloud, said B. Rowlett, a writer who led the campaign and wrote a book inspired by Wollstonecraft. It's supposed to be commingling female forms, on top of which, and kind of emerging from which, is a small, naked, and very defiant, quite fierce-looking figure. Let's address the elephant in the room here. All together now, why didn't they just make a sculpture of her? Well, I'm glad you asked. In the same interview, Rowlett said, putting individuals on pedestals is, a bit passé in many ways. You don't have to look far to see that around the world, thanks to Black Lives Matter, the whole topic of statues and who gets memorialized is becoming incredibly, intensely scrutinized, and quite rightly too. So I see this as part of that debate of who we memorialize and how we do it. Again, this was another sentiment that made sense to me until I started to think about it. Why do we make public sculptures of or for people? It's to celebrate them, to celebrate their achievements and themselves as outstanding individuals. The act of having a public sculpture is to put someone on a pedestal. The problem that we see during the Black Lives Matter movement is people take a look at these sculptures and at the people they're celebrating and decide that, you know what, these people aren't worth celebrating to begin with. Whether the sculpture has the likeness of that person or not has nothing to do with this. Say in the future, some documents resurface that Mary Wollstonecraft owned slaves. Do you think people will not pull the statue down just because, oh guys, it's for her, not of her, you see? If you find the whole idea of putting people on pedestals problematic to begin with, why even bother having one? If you want a public sculpture celebrating an idea, do that. There's been plenty, and a lot of them great. If you want to celebrate a woman whose life and achievements you deem worthy of celebrating, do that. Pick a lane, people. This is where the seed of this project got sown, because I was like, if you won't make a statue of her, then I'll draw her myself, you cowards. And I'll make a video about it too. And then I calmed down a bit and wondered, all of this I'm reading came from one of the organizers. I wonder what the artist herself has to say about it. So I found an interview with the artist, Maggie Hambling, which was a very entertaining read to me because it seemed like the interviewer was trying to do the same thing I'm doing, which was listen to each of her reason and then go, yeah, but why? A piece in The Guardian was headlined, "Why I Hate the Mary Wollstonecraft Statue. Would a man be honored with a schlong out?" Hambling replies, "Oh, but there are plenty of schlongs honoring men in art." This is true, but not far from this spot on the facade of the Royal Academy, 4 male philosophers, Francis Bacon, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, John Locke, and Adam Smith, are all honored fully clothed. The feeling was that the work played to the male gaze, offering yet another obligingly passive and implausibly perky female nude. So shouldn't Hambling have honored the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women with her clothes on? The figure had to be nude because clothes define people, she says. Put someone in country tweeds and they become horsey. Put someone in period dress and they become part of history. I don't want to do that to her. The better alternative is to leave her naked, the same way male artists have depicted women in art for the entire history of art. Okay, none of this actually matters because very quickly I finally understood. Maggie Hambling is a fine artist, and she doesn't care what you think of her art. It's not her job to. Making you, us, happy was not her brief. This is a woman whose most famous work before this was this memorial of Oscar Wilde. Do you think she cares about accurately representing her quote-unquote subjects? No! Her job was to take Mary Wollstonecraft, a name that has been all but forgotten by people outside of academia, and put it back on the lips of every single person in the country and beyond. It doesn't matter how she does it. It worked! Everyone was talking about this, and here I am, 4 months later, talking about it. And here you are, listening to me and watching me talk about it. What we do from here is none of her business. Her job's done. She said it herself. It goes out into the world and I'm not in charge of it anymore. And that's why, even though I really don't like her work on many levels, I absolutely respect it. What I'm doing here by making this illustration and video is not really an answer to Maggie Hamlin's sculpture, it's a continuation of it. She started the conversation, and now I'd like to move it along to a place that I personally find productive. Now, we've already established that it doesn't matter, but from reading this interview, after all the research I've done, I think Maggie and I have come to two very different understandings of Mary Wollstonecraft. You know how inspiration can come from the strangest places? Well, I found this disagreement very inspiring, and I allowed that to inform my choices in this composition, using them almost as prompts. Take, for example, the choice of making public artwork for her, not of her. You know what? Fine. But the more I think about it, I realized that I also really didn't like the idea of what B. Rowlatt described as commingling female forms, on top of which and kind of emerging from which is a small, naked, and very defiant, quite fierce-looking figure. That didn't strike me the right way. From what I've read of her work, Mary Wollstonecraft was all about individuality and each woman breaking free of dependency, standing up on their own 2 feet and helping themselves, not waiting or relying on anyone else. After all, where did depending on people got Mary? Most of A Vindication of the Rights of Women is her berating women for not doing it for themselves. Quote, "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures, instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone." So the idea of all of womankind being an apomorphic, shapeless blob, sacrificing their identity to prop up one nameless, imaginary, symbolic woman, seems to be the opposite of what Mary was fighting for. And then there's the point that Maggie Hambling made, that the figure had to be nude, because clothes define people to a time and place and expectations, for example. Maggie saw that as an argument for nudity, whereas I saw it as one for putting some clothes on her. Putting the whole male gaze thing and the history of objectified naked ladies in art aside, I think it's very important that we see Mary Wollstonecraft in the context of her time and environment. This was a woman who was shaped by her experience and what she saw around her. The fact that during her lifetime, one of the only jobs available for an educated woman was to be a governess gave her the experience that directly inspired her to write her first book on the education of women. This woman was there during the French Revolution. That is a remarkable thing to me, and not a thing that women at any time could have experienced. A lot of her struggles were directly because she was alive in that time. Mary was an observer. Her work was radical because it was so deeply informed by her time and environment. She wasn't a timeless woman. She was a remarkable woman of the time, which is why I want to depict her not just in the clothes she would have worn, but in the middle of the places she would have been. Oh wait, what's this? Could it be the pin we put in well-meaning but ultimately disastrous post-mortem betrayal at the beginning of the research? Well, yes it is! One of the biggest reasons why Mary Wollstonecraft had not been properly acknowledged for her monumental work for so long was that a year after her death, her sweet, adorable, loving, caring, wholesome husband, William Godwin, published a biography of her. He wanted the world to know the real her, the woman that had been through and survived so much, the woman full of flaws and contradictions that he loved so dearly. So he wrote it all in there, sparing no details, from her troubled youth to her love affairs, illegitimate children, depression, and suicide attempts. Need I remind you that this was the 18th century, and Mary was already somewhat of an outcast with all the defending the French Revolution and female independence talk. Oh yeah, you bet polite 18th century society cancelled her into oblivion. Quite literally. After the biography came out, no one cared about her work anymore. Her reputation was in tatters, and the name Mary Wollstonecraft was henceforth synonymous with scandals and vicious satires about this freakish woman with a pointed pen and loose morals. What life and influence she might have had from beyond the grave, Godwin killed it dead with his sweet, well-meaning pen. It wasn't until at least a century later that people started rediscovering her work with unclouded eyes. So imagine the rage I felt when the conversations around this piece of art meant to celebrate her weren't at all about her writings and contributions in pioneering feminism, but all about her tits being out and, is that pubic hair? No, I don't want my Mary just standing there, defiant and fierce in her birthday suit. I want her in the clothes she would have worn every day, in the middle of the places and people that she cared about, doing her work, writing, observing, talking to people, listening to their stories, finding ways to defend them, even if it's from themselves. That's what I want to remember her for. In answer to the question of why the figure in her sculpture was so small, Maggie Hambling said, most male historic statues are way over life size. My point was that female figure doesn't need to dominate to be powerful. To that I say, oh spare me, Maggie. This is the kind of talk many women have had to put up with, even to this day. I bet you've had to put up with plenty of this. I don't feel empowered looking at your tiny woman firing off into the sky in her rocket of hope. Do you know what I feel empowered looking at? This! It makes me want to roar and slice some fools and rock out on stage and do a PowerPoint that slaps and run for president of the multiverse. That thing's in Russia, Maggie. Imagine being out-feminist by the bloody Russians. I want future children, when they're looking back and trying to understand the history of feminism and the fight for equality, to see Mary Wollstonecraft and to see her as a giant.
It's such a shame. He knows how to do everything but love me.
So yeah, that was my illustrating Mary Wollstonecraft video. Maybe this could inspire you to learn more about her, read some of her work, maybe make some art of your own. Maybe bring her up as a cool discussion topic at your next Zoom party. I hope this video also gave you an insight into my process of making an illustration. An idea don't just pop into my head and I make a full drawing of it and call it a day. No, it's a process of research and idea generation and refinement and getting really fired up about the topic I'm illustrating and hopefully channeling that energy into the work itself. That's what's fun about illustration for me. And I'm sure you're all dying to know, yes, I have prints! This illustration will be available on my wee little Etsy shop as A4 prints and fancy limited edition G-Clay art prints in A3. So head over there if you want a cool Wollstonecraft on your walls. Due to visa stuff, my shop will only be open till this September 2021. So get some stuff while you still can. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you so much for watching. I have loads of ideas of videos I want to make this year. So if you want to stay tuned, tap on that handy little subscribe button downstairs. Downstairs? Down there. And leave a comment. What is your favorite fact about Mary Wollstonecraft? And what do you think about her life and legacy? That's all for now. See you around!
So give me undivided attention.
Sorry. Ow! But ultimately this... Oh, where's the pin gone? I dropped the pin. This is bad, people. Bad, I tell you. Oh well, get another pin. Ow, I sat on it!